In this video, we will be looking at the biomechanics of the football throw in under 10 minutes. This is presented by Jose and Haley. So we will start this off by just breaking down the 3 phases of the football throw. First, beginning with the loading phase, just to get a general idea of what this looks like from an outside view. Right now we're looking at a famous football player. He is bringing his arm back, bringing the football back, preparing it to be thrown. And here we'll just observe all the joint motions as we replay it a few times, down at the legs, even up at the trunk. And then we can move into the acceleration phase, which is when he brings the ball forward. We can see all the joint motion, not only at the top where the ball is, but also near the bottom, at the knee and the ankle joints. And we'll just watch that a few times. And then there's a follow-through phase where the ball leaves the hand. You can see his final position in comparison to his starting position. And here's just another view, the posterior view of the football throw, just to get another vision of how the joints move in unison to perform this exercise or this motion. We'll just watch that a few times. And then we will move into breaking down the joints. So first is the scapulothoracic joint, where the scapula meets the thorax of the body. And we will see motion there throughout each movement. Here's the glenohumeral joint, where the humerus meets the glenoid fossa of the scapula, and this is also known as the shoulder joint. And I believe we get to see another angle of the glenohumeral joint from the anterior view. We also see that clavicle meeting the scapula just above the humerus. Then we see the elbow, where the humerus meets the radius and ulna. And next we see the hip joint. And this is just a picture of the left hip as of now, but we'll just imagine for the sake of the video that it would be applicable to both sides. Here's the knee joint with the femur and the tibia, and then the patella in the front. And then finally the ankle joint, where the bones of the lower leg meet the bones of the feet. So now we will get to break down the biomechanical pieces of the throw, starting with the starting position. At the right scapula, there's slight depression, and then at the left scapula, there's slight upward rotation. And these are concentric contractions utilized for stabilization. Here is the right glenohumeral joint, which undergoes flexion, and then at the left glenohumeral joint, there is also slight flexion, less than the right. And here again is just another view of the glenohumeral joint, as I mentioned before. And then we move into the elbow. At the right elbow, there is over 90 degrees of flexion, and then at the left elbow, there should be less than 90 degrees of flexion. And then moving on to the hip, the right hip, there should be slight flexion, and then also slight flexion at the left hip joint. Moving on to the knee. At the right knee, there should be slight flexion utilized for stabilization, and then at the left, there should be little to no motion at that joint. And then finally, at the ankle, there should be dorsiflexion and slight inversion. And then at the left, there should be the opposite with plantar flexion and slight eversion. Now we will begin to dissect the loading phase, which is when the ball is brought back past the head, coming out of that starting position. At the right ST joint, there's adduction and depression caused by a concentric contraction, and at the left, there's upward rotation and protraction. Moving on to the shoulder, at the right one, there should be external rotation and horizontal abduction, and at the left, there should be about 90 degrees of flexion caused by concentric contractions. And here's just another view of the shoulder, as we mentioned before, where the humerus meets the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Then at the elbow, there should be flexion and pronation caused by a concentric contraction, and at the left elbow, there should again be about 90 degrees of flexion, also caused by a concentric contraction. At the right hip, there's flexion and pelvic rotation, which is an isometric contraction. Then at the left, there's extension and abduction, which is both eccentric and concentric. At the right knee, there's flexion, and at the left knee, there is extension caused by a concentric contraction. At the right ankle, there is dorsiflexion and inversion, and then the opposite at the left ankle with plantar flexion and eversion. And now we'll move on to the second phase, which is the acceleration phase, which we will demonstrate a few times for you here with the skeleton. At the right ST joint, there's a lot of motion with upward rotation, protraction, elevation, and abduction. And then at the left, there's protraction and adduction caused by an isometric contraction. Then at the right GH joint, there's horizontal adduction as well as internal rotation. And then at the left, there's horizontal abduction and internal rotation. And then here is, again, another view of the GH joint. We will just show this every time after we show the initial view of the GH joint. Then at the hip, the right hip undergoes extension, internal rotation, and adduction. And then the left undergoes flexion and abduction. Then at the elbow, the right elbow goes through extension and pronation via a concentric contraction, and the left undergoes flexion via an isometric contraction. At the right knee joint, there's extension and stabilization via concentric and isometric contractions, and then flexion and stabilization at the left. And then finally at the ankle, there's plantar flexion and inversion caused by a concentric contraction, and then at the left, there's dorsiflexion, eversion, and stabilization. Moving on to the third phase, which is the follow-through phase, there will be a lot of eccentric contractions due to the slowing down of the body parts after the movement. Here is a close-up of the final position, or what we've attempted to put the skeleton in. At the right ST joint, there is depression and protraction caused by eccentric contractions, and then the left undergoes retraction and posterior tilt. At the right GH joint, there's extension, adduction, and internal rotation. And then at the left, there's horizontal adduction and external rotation. Another view of the GH joint, I think it's important to just see the joint from various angles to get a better understanding of how it would function. And then at the right hip, there's extension, adduction, internal rotation. And then at the left hip joint, there is just external rotation caused eccentrically. At the right elbow, there's extension, flexion, and pronation caused by eccentric contractions. And then at the left, there is just flexion caused by a concentric contraction. At the right knee, there's flexion, internal rotation, and stabilization, which are eccentric and isometric contractions. And then flexion, internal rotation, and stabilization at the left knee. At the right ankle, there's plantar flexion, inversion, and stabilization, all three contractions, and then same at the left with dorsiflexion, eversion, and stabilization. And that concludes our biomechanical breakdown of the football throw, and we'll just observe all joint actions together one more time as we get to appreciate and understand all the muscle activity, joint activity, and just body activity that occurs during such a simple motion such as the football throw. The end.